Good evening. This is Going Viral, and today is March 23rd, 2022. So today there's Ken Aaron. I'm here from Los Angeles. Mike Jankowitz. I keep forgetting, I think it's Queens, but he gets around a lot. Dennis Goldstein from New Jersey. And Stephen Jonas. You're in Boston, aren't you?
No, I'm on Long Island,
Oh, you're on Long Island. Where?
but I'm originally, well, I'm in Port Jefferson.
Port Jefferson. Okay.
Yeah, but I was born and raised in New York, and I'm fond of saying, "Less a New Yorker, you're always a New Yorker." So
That's right. You can't you can't get that pizza out of your blood.
can't get it out of your blood.
Okay, so those are the only people we have tonight. But fortunately, Stephen has a treatise
Well,
he'd like to
wait,
go over. Mike, what is it, Mike?
do we have Dennis?
Oh, yeah, didn't I mention Dennis Goldstein in New Jersey? Yeah,
Yeah.
he's in New Jersey. So, Stephen, why don't you present? This is a treatise about Ukraine. Where is that? The Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, it's about Ukraine, and it's about Putin, and about why why he did what he did in
Good.
terms of not only invading Ukraine, but also.
Oh, I muted you by mistake. Please unmute yourself, Steve. Unmute yourself. I won't do that again.
It's okay if you do. There. Yeah, it's a column that was published several days ago on opednews.com, and it was actually published last week, and it also was published yesterday on buzzflash.com, in which I attempt to understand why Putin did what he did, and I. Looking at the bulk of the explanations, I don't think any of them apply. I don't think that Putin is concerned about neo-Nazis in Ukraine to the extent that there are, and to the extent that they have major influence in the government. There's a lot of disagreement about that. I think that the claim that he invaded because 13,000 members of the Azov battalion were about to invade the Donbass doesn't make any sense, because we've known for a couple of years that there were somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Russian troops camped just over the border. So it's doubtful that they would do that. I think that I don't think that he really cares very much about. Well, I think he probably to the extent that this man cares about anything. Yeah, he probably cares about the Russians in the Russian, predominantly Russian-speaking eastern provinces, and he didn't. There has been, unfortunately, and doesn't get too much publicity now, there was resistance from the Zelensky government to implementing the Minsk agreement, which would have really pretty well settled things in the eastern provinces and given them a degree of local autonomy. They're primarily Russian-speaking. There was the Nazi Party and there is a far-right party in the Ukrainian parliament, which is very small, but they did want to eliminate bilinguality for the eastern provinces. The Minsk Agreement would have guaranteed that, and also a certain degree of autonomy for the Russian-speaking eastern provinces. As far as Ukraine is concerned, as far as Crimea is concerned, and I've spoken to this on this program and also written about it more than one occasion. I regarded the claim, the incorporation of Crimea into Russia in 2015 after the change of government in Kyiv as quite logical. In fact, I would have been very surprised if Putin hadn't done that. everybody knows, Crimea is the location of Russia's only warm water port, that is Sevastopol, historically famous Sevastopol. And it was under the previous government, it was held on a lease, for a 30-year lease. And the incoming government, which was clearly, I'm about to say anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, hold on a second now, clearly could have just canceled the lease. Leases are cancelable. They could make up some reasons and find it in the agreement, whatever. So, and the Russians were not about to do that. And it happens that the people who live in Crimea are about 90% Russian speaking. So I thought that was understandable and reasonable. And that, you know, of course, it had been part of Russia for a very long time. In fact, Ukraine was, Sevastopol was given back to Ukraine by, I'm sorry, Crimea was given back to Ukraine by Khrushchev in I forget what year, but at any rate, and they very quickly built the bridge across the Kerch Strait. It looks like it's an auto and rail bridge. So that made a lot of sense. So, you know, and Putin could have easily defended the Russian speakers in the eastern provinces if the attack, the planned attack, which has been reported in a number of different places. I see it on left-wing listservs, which are actually pro-Putin. It's fascinating. You got a bunch of left-wing listservs who were pro-Putin. Very interesting. Anyway, so what I speculated in this column was the following. Putin sits atop of a plutocracy. A plutocracy is defined as a government of the few very wealthy individuals, and those are the oligarchs. That's how Russian politics and the economy are organized. They're organized around the oligarchs. There is a parliament, the old name going back to the Tsarist era, it's called the Duma, which has really no power. So he's got this form of government. And then I just published a column yesterday, which we might want to talk about later, but which goes beyond the one I'm talking about now, that I sent around, I sent around to you, Ken, and to Jim. I think that Putin thought that if he invaded Ukraine, rather than simply saying Crimea is mine, the eastern provinces are mine because they're primarily Russian speakers, and if anybody dares set a foot across that border, they're going to be met with the full force of the Russian army. He said, okay, I'm going to show the world I can take Ukraine, the whole thing. And he wasn't doing it just because of the chicken Kiev and the borscht, and which are both great, by the way. I've had them in Kiev a long time ago. I think, seriously, I think that he thought that if he did this, he would mobilize a group of plutocrats around the world to support him. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, particularly Hungary. I mean, in Europe, and a member of the European Union, a member of NATO. And I think he also thought that he was going to get outside support, unconditional support from China, and that he could mobilize a group of nations that are plutocracies, Saudi Arabia. And I think that's why he did it. That, of course, did not happen. And now P is engaged in, to the extent he can do it, the destruction of Ukraine, which of course makes no sense. But people like Putin do not operate on the basis of sense. So that's essentially what I said in that particular column, that it was an attempt to mobilize plutocrats. The title of the column was "Make the World Safe for Plutocracy." Remember the old post-World War II slogan, "Make the world safe for democracy." Democracy, of course, defined in the capitalist sense. Make the world safe for plutocracy. He didn't get it. He did not get the support that he hoped he was going to get. China is, I think, playing a very bad role there. They're fence sitting, and everybody knows that. That's not an original observation. And how it's going to turn out in the end for them, I don't know. But anyway, that's essentially what I said in the paper column.
Unmute myself. I have a question for Mike Jankowitz. Okay? Mike, please unmute yourself if you're not. And tell me this. Do you think the drama that's going on with Putin is closest to King Lear, Macbeth, or the Emperor Jones in Haiti?
That's an odd combination.
Well, they're all failed emperors.
Well, King Lear is not a
No, come on.
figure, not a failed emperor.
He's a retired king who didn't get his family support. That's what happened.
Right. I wouldn't put him in that category.
No, God, no.
And I don't even know if the word emperor applies, except with the Emperor Jones. The Scottish play, as we call it in the theater, for ridiculous reasons that have to do with superstition. That is simply a power grab. You might say it's a failed emperor, or an attempted failed emperor. Anyway, I recoil a little bit at making these, in other words, kind of becoming trite Shakespearean comparisons or something. We could also compare it in some ways to Julius Caesar.
I was going to say Julius Caesar. That's the most likely.
Yeah, although Julius Caesar.
Oh, we are. I think we're past the Ides of March, right?
Yeah, just recently.
Yeah. And I don't think that was really a possible thing in Russia, but but Julius Caesar would come closer. It's funny because we can compare this to certain dramas or certain characters, but it's a very specific situation. It is the stuff of drama. It is the stuff of a political tragedy, and I'm sure somebody will turn it into a play or adapt or stage a Shakespearean drama, maybe like Julius Caesar or Coriolanus or something, in which they set it in modern day Russia. But I think I will say this much about Putin: the problem that I have, excuse me, is that Putin, of course, there's a saying in Russia, once KGB, always KGB. But Putin has not been acting like a KGB trained operative, which is what he was. So that is where, in other words, he's kind of veered off from his own character in that sense, from his own profile. Unless there's something going on in his mind that we don't know about. I'm sure there's plenty going on in his mind that we don't know about or can't figure out. I will say one thing, by the way, because you mentioned this, Steve. Your assessment is definitely valid, and is a definite possibility. However, one mistake Putin made is that he assumed if somebody, and a lot of people have made this mistake in assessing the situation, that if somebody is Russian speaking, that means they automatically are sympathetic to or allied with Russia. And that's not the case.
Did I interrupt there?
Yeah. Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. I think you've been referring to Russian-speaking Ukrainians and significant numbers of them who have come out strongly opposed to the invasion. That's been reported.
Well, and actually, we know that in the areas in which Russian troops entered, in which it was overwhelmingly Russian speaking, they were met with a degree of opposition that couldn't have come from just a minute minority. So basically, I mean, that's a big mistake that people make. They say, well, these people speak the same language, therefore they would want us in power. Well, they may speak the same language, but they may enjoy other things such as democracy or more freedom or more choice that their fellow Russian speakers do not seem to enjoy, and therefore they do not want to be part of that government. Also, Ukraine has a history of having been kind of brutalized by Russia. There was a starvation of the pre-World War II era, and there have been a lot of problems between Ukraine and Russia, between Ukraine and the Russian government, and therefore I think what we have more is a situation of all these miscalculations by Putin that is not. That does not seem that would not you would not normally expect from a highly trained and highly competent intelligence officer. The kind of more practical, impassioned or passionless evaluation, sort of the cold calculation that intelligence officers or especially KGB agents would do, was not there. So I don't know whether or not maybe he did have this overriding thing of making the world safe for plutocracy. If I can quote you, Steve.
I'm delighted that you're doing that.
Right. Well,
seriously, Mike. Thank you.
Yes, that's okay. I hope I'm not the only one quoting you. I hope.
I hope not.
But I think that, the situation right now, Putin's in a difficult situation because he's kind of gotten himself in a mess, and there seems to be no way to get out without looking bad. He's looking bad not only to the rest of the world, but to his own people. But again, he's facing, if this becomes a protracted thing, and we've heard that Ukrainian forces, I don't know if you discussed it yesterday, that Ukrainian forces have retaken a couple of small towns, suburbs, including one key junction, a junction of sort, which reminded me when I heard that the Ukrainians retook it and held it. It reminded me of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne holding Bastogne against the German counterattack during what we call the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans' Ardennes counteroffensive, and that was somewhat crucial in defeating the German counteroffensive. And this could prove to be just as valuable. Russia has never been good on logistics, but they've been taking quite a long time in repairing the logistic failure, especially since it wasn't a matter of moving logistics across an ocean or across a body of water. They just have to move their logistics across a artificial border, a map-drawn border on the ground. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of mistakes going on. That's my question about Putin. It's not just his motivation why he's doing it, although I agree that it couldn't be just to put it this way, the only pragmatic reason is to get the warm water port back, or put it this way, to connect the warm water ports with Russia proper. But even so, if that's the case, then he should be negotiating now to keep a corridor. And again, I don't know how they're going to keep that corridor, if it means, taking a piece of Ukraine that includes, Odessa and some major cities. But
they don't need Odessa in order to have a connection between Crimea and the Donbass.
Right. Well, between Crimea, yes, I know that, but it's still very thin. But if that's what he wants to keep, if that's what he wants, he should be negotiating that now, and that should be the means.
I agree with everything you say, Mike, which leads me to believe that the reason he did this has nothing to do with the facts on the ground.
No, it doesn't.
With this plutocracy thing. That's why I came up with that idea. Because because what's going on now makes no sense. I mean, he has totally alienated the vast majority of the population of Ukraine, and if the reports are correct, apparently a significant number of Russian speakers in Ukraine, not in the Donbass, but in Ukraine proper. There are Russian speakers in Ukraine proper. I think, I forget which major city has a majority of Russian speakers. I mean, the languages have been mixed for centuries. They're apparently, similar. They use the same writing system, and there are Ukrainians living in Russia and who have lived in Russia for a long time, but maintain their Ukrainian identity at least. And they have family in Ukraine who are at risk of being killed by the Russian army. I mean, it's just,
I once did a show with some Vietnam vets, and they talked and explained to me friendly fire, which was they used to go out on patrol and make a lot of noise. The Vietnamese would recognize them, and they'd make noise, and they just agreed not to kill each other. But sometimes you'd get a star-studded lieutenant who wanted you to go out on an aggressive patrol, and he'd get knocked off by one of the regular enlistees.
Really? Wow.
That wasn't
friendly fire. That's fragging.
Cragging, okay, that's the proper term.
Yeah.
And I'm bringing that up because I did read an article today about some cragging with the Russian army. Where a guy ran over, an officer with a tank because he was, he didn't agree with the orders he was getting. So, that could be very demoralizing. And also, there was another
was run over, Ken.
Pardon me?
I say demoralizing, particularly for the officer who was run over.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't care anymore. He's gone.
I see.
But and also that Putin was sending special troops out to discourage people from deserting, but killing them by implementing a Kula Khan type morality.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt you, Ken, for a second.
Go ahead.
For a bit of information. The Red Army, or on orders from Stalin, actually did that during the Second World War. They had something called Smersh troops, a Smersh being an organization that was loyal primarily to Stalin. They would have a few machine guns set up behind the Red Army, let's say a Red Army division. They would have, let's say, 30 machine guns set up, and anybody retreating would be mowed down.
Yep, you wouldn't go in the wrong direction.
Right. So
and what'd you call it, the Vietnam thing? Cragging? C-R... How do you spell it?
F as in Frank.
Oh, fragging. That's right. You're right. Now I remember. They called it fragging. So I think the Russian military might be starting to do that, which is a sign of decay of morality in the army. Yeah.
Not morality, morale. Again, the word is morale.
Okay,
Although it
morale.
deals with morality also, but
Yeah, morale.
defining morale.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but we're getting reports of higher levels in the Russian army being very unhappy about what's happening there. You know,
Yeah, well, and also in the 15th general got killed.
15.
Major leaders, 15 so far.
It's up to 15 now?
Yeah. You
15?
got to read the Daily News, the Daily Mail. I mean, everything in the Daily Mail.
Oh, the Daily Mail. I wouldn't believe a word I read in the Daily
Oh, come
Mail
on.
other than the word the.
No.
I will
Okay.
believe the word the
Okay.
appearing in the Daily Mail.
Okay. Well, maybe they say things you don't like to hear, but I haven't found anything. They get high ratings for integrity and legitimacy from organizations that rank news sources. So they may be radical or weird, but they're not. They're not.
But
It's verified.
that's got to be the only Murdoch.
Anytime they show who got killed, they got a picture and a name.
I see. Well, that's got to be the only publication, a Murdoch publication in the world gets high ranking for doing an honorary job.
The only Murdoch publication, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, half of the articles are about who's wearing a bikini today and so
Well,
forth.
those are now. If I were seeing the Daily Mail, I mean, there's certain things I would definitely look at. So.
Yeah, there's that. But anyhow, so those are all. So maybe they'll fall apart. Hey, does anybody have any idea or know any knowledge about who would take over if Putin yields or gives up or gets killed or he's gone, or what would happen?
Well,
Go on.
you want me to speculate on
Yeah,
that?
sure. Speculate away.
Michael, speculate. Well, and my speculation is that it depends how that would happen. If Putin has an enormous ego, he also has a lot of money, and he might decide, okay, as you said before, the time is now to retire. But if it went to one of his henchmen like Medvedev, the policy probably wouldn't change. If he is removed from office in one way or another, then the removers are going to say who becomes the head of the government. And I think they're also, one would hope that they would also have some kind of say in moving away from this totally dictatorial form of government where the Duma is a figure. There is a Duma, a parliament. It's a figurehead to a Duma that has some kind of authority. I'm sure it's there in the Constitution, but it's just not paid any attention to. So it's obvious, excellent question, obvious question, but it's also obvious. It depends if Putin goes, who would do the pushing out and how it would be done.
Would the UN, I know this is a dream, but could the UN move in with some kind of a temporary government?
I don't think you can find that anywhere in the UN Charter. I don't think the Russians, any Russian position of power, would accept that, even if it were. And I don't think that exists anywhere in the United Nations Charter.
So we can look back historically what happened when Yeltsin got in power. He was a mayor of Moscow, right? And he became the prime minister or the head of the state. So this is just a few little street demonstrations, a little bravado, and you had a coup.
Yeah, well, I published a column, the second column on this subject, which if you want me to talk about the next column, but I'd certainly like to hear what Mike has to say about what he thinks would happen or could happen if Yeltsin is replaced. I'd like to hear his perspective.
Not Yeltsin. You mean Putin?
I mean Putin. Yeah, Yeltsin's long gone.
Yeltsin's been replaced already.
Okay.
Actually, it depends upon the scenario. If it's a populist, in other words, what happened when the Soviet Union fell, when Yeltsin standing on top of a tank and the army refused.
That occurred well after when the Soviet Union fell, Mike. But the tank,
No,
yeah.
I'm combining everything. That type of situation where it was in general a popular uprising against the ruling the people, the ruling elite, people in power, the government in power, or the system in power. If it's something like that, then of course you would have some sort of populist. I don't know if it'll be Navalny. They'd have to find out what prison or maximum security prison they've sent them to, but it could be somebody like that. But if it's done from within the government, something like people who were hoping would happen with the 25th Amendment type of thing during Trump's era, another failed emperor, then I think what you would probably, it seems to be what happens very often in Russian history is if they replace somebody with a much more, let's say, lower profile, a more, calmer, perhaps less dramatic, and less, less of a star type figure, and more of a low key, calming figure who would restore a bit of normalcy without giving up the power, without changing the power structure or the system in operation. So I would probably be somebody with, a kind of low key type of, more pragmatic and less blustery type of figure. That's who I think they would they would get until at least they restored some sort of stability, both not only in Ukraine but in Russia itself. Who that figure would be, we may not know who that figure. It may be somebody who's always been in the shadows, but it would be kind of that person who's somebody who would be overshadowed by a Putin or somebody like that, by a high octane figure. And you would have more of a low octane figure who would just emerge from the shadows and just basically say, okay, let's get out of this thing as practically and as, rationally as possible, and let's everybody calm down and just, try to reestablish basically a stable society and a stable foreign policy. That's my opinion. So we don't even, not only do we not have to know who that person is right now, but it would probably be somebody there would be no reason we would know about who he is. He would be somebody who would just basically be selected to get the boat back on some sort of course and just hold that course.
Well, in Russian politics, is it most likely to be a military person or a legislative person? Where's the power going there? Isn't it with the generals?
It could be a general. It could be, but it would not be a general who was a bombastic or a gung ho type of general. It would be something. It would be somebody more akin to, usually World War II analogy, more akin to an Eisenhower or a Bradley than a Patton or a McCarthy.
I was, excuse me, Mike, but as you were getting into that sentence, I said, yeah, it's either going to be, he's going to say it's either Ike or Patton. That's right.
Well, Patton would be the wrong choice, as I think would.
Well, yeah, and there are certain. Can I interrupt for a second and tell a Patton story that you may or may not know? But you know a lot about World War II, so you may very well know this. When Patton accepted the surrender of one of the German armies in southern Germany, I forget which one it was. Instead of collecting their arms, the small arms, he had them stack them, because what Patton wanted to do was join up with the remnants of the Wehrmacht and drive east against the Red Army. When Eisenhower found out about this, he went, apeshit and just dismissed Patton. And then, of course, we know about a month later, Patton was dismissed permanently. And, there is suspicion as to whether it was an accident or not, but Patton was gone. Are you familiar with that story?
Oh, yes, yes. I'm familiar with that. Also, the fact that Patton wanted to not just revive Wehrmacht officers, but Wehrmacht units, but SS units, Waffen SS units.
That I didn't know.
Well, he was certainly willing to. He wanted to go up against the Russians, which, of course,
Yeah.
By May 1944, every American
45.
45, excuse me. Every American was just, you could just tell, was just saying, that's what we want to do. Finish this war, win this war, and then get into an even bigger one. That was just, Patton was just not only crazy, but out of touch. Patton also, he had...
But anyway, I interrupted you, sorry.
No, but it's interesting you bring up Patton, because Patton had very fascist tendencies. I think he was one of the most overrated commanders of World War II, in that he was an excellent tactician and a terrible strategist, and also he may have been mentally ill.
Really?
People are functional in his job, but certainly mentally unstable in anything outside of that narrow tactical area that he was good in.
Yeah, well,
Hey, you guys are leaving out a dear friend of all of us, General MacArthur.
Another one. Both Patton and MacArthur fall into the same category, which is
show business.
And that their hype was. I know people who served under both of them, obviously, and one comment. I remember when the theory first came out in the late '60s and early '70s, when it was going around that Patton, people were trying to publish books and films that Patton may have been assassinated. And the people I knew who served with Patton would say, yeah, but who are the bad guys in the story? In other words,
wow.
they were trying to kill Patton. And usually what Patton and MacArthur are invoked usually by, very often by right-wingers, but also people who know very little about military history and about military strategy, and just are looking to prove some right-wing or even fascistic thought that the best way to do something is to just barrel on through and just, keep on going and just basically kick ass without realizing that you can get your own ass kicked. A lot of the credit that went to Patton, and I give him this much, he did put some very good officers. He had very good divisional and corps commanders. So he knew who would do the right thing, who would be good at, who themselves were good military operatives. But much of what he got credit for, and the same goes to MacArthur, were due to people underneath him, which is very often the case with, high-ranking officers. But some of the things Patton wanted to do were just outright crazy. This whole thing that Patton was a better military commander than Montgomery. Patton, the way I heard it was that Patton was Montgomery was an average tactician and an above average, but not brilliant, but above average strategist. Whereas Patton was an excellent tactician and a horrible strategist. If he was one rank above what he had gotten, the war could have turned out to be in the ETO could have turned out to be a disaster, or certainly prolonged.
Okay.
I'd just like to make a couple
Go ahead.
quick comments on Patton and also on Monty. To me, the one great thing that Patton did, and this is very well known, I was just watching a film on the Battle of the Bulge, about the 70th one I've seen of the Battle of the Bulge. When Patton drove the Third Army, the tanks, 150 miles north to relieve the surrounded U.S. In the Ardennes. That was quite a remarkable achievement, moving all those tanks that quickly.
Well, that was for Bastogne.
Yeah,
thing
exactly. Yeah.
to relieve that.
Right.
But by the way, he held them for about close to 24 hours. He stopped the relief of Bastogne.
Really? Oh,
He
I
could
didn't know.
get up to the front. Well, supposedly that he could get up there. So he kind of pulled them back from going in and relieving them for not quite a day, but he
Wow.
wanted to make sure he was on hand to take some of the credit, or at
Oh
least
boy,
that's
that I didn't know. I
um,
mean, and then on Monty may have, certainly. I mean, Monty's big and very important victory was at El Alamein, which corresponded to the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, and essentially that meant that the Germans had lost. It took 3 more years, but the Germans had lost because of those two parallel victories. But of course, we all know about A Bridge Too Far, which in northern Holland, which was just a disaster that Monty went a bridge too far, and it was a disaster. As far as MacArthur is concerned,
with Eisenhower's approval, by the way. The Market Garden was with Eisenhower.
Market Garden was with. Oh well, okay. So both bear responsibility. I just read recently that the return to the Philippines and the insistence on going to the Philippines and the landing in Leyte Gulf, which a lot of luck and a lot of heroism from the crews on those small carriers prevented a total disaster at Leyte Gulf. But I read recently that MacArthur insisted on the landing in the Philippines and in the Philippine campaign, which was sort of out of the way geographically, and that Nimitz wanted to go straight north and bypass the Philippines and isolate the Japanese in the Philippines with his huge submarine force, which might have led to the ending of the war much sooner or somewhat sooner and sooner enough to avoid the use of atomic weapons. I mean, Nimitz didn't know anything about the atomic weapons, but that, so you talk about strategy. I think, Nimitz was, very quiet, and, we never heard much from him, heard a lot about him.
Well, Nimitz was a low-key guy, but Nimitz was a real genius of the Pacific of the.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, he wanted to bypass the Philippines just the way a whole bunch of other Japanese, like Peleliu, stronghold like Peleliu, were bypassed, and it was brilliant to just leave them. They were sitting there. They couldn't get any supplies. They couldn't get any ammunition, and they just sat there. They essentially ran out of fuel, and they couldn't fly their planes.
But it's interesting because I'm actually going to move this back to the topic we're should be talking about, which is Ukraine. But there was a couple of interesting parallels that we brought out. First of all, in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, we talk about the baby flat tops, the escort carriers that managed to get away, well, not unscathed. But that
they held off the Japanese fleet.
Well, the destroyers, but what was probably more influential was the decisive American victory at Surigao Strait, which Jesse Oldendorf, the admiral there, was in charge of, in which they stopped the bottom of the Japanese pincer.
Right.
There's a lot. I mean, we have in our little diner crowd, as Jim likes to call it. We've been having an ongoing argument about the Battle of Leyte Gulf for about 14 years now. So, but it's interesting when you talk about MacArthur made a lot of mistakes. MacArthur grabbed a lot of credit, which is really Nimitz's. And Nimitz was a low-key guy who just wanted to get the job done. He wasn't interested in his own self-aggrandizement, which is the opposite of MacArthur. And so basically MacArthur was able to grab a lot of this credit, which Patton did to a large degree also. By the way, Market Garden is an interesting example as far as Ukraine, because the brilliant, excellent General Brian Horrocks, who was in charge of the ground operations, that is not the airborne, but the ground operation that was supposed to break through, had said to apparently said to Montgomery and to Montgomery's staff that he had a lot of qualms about going up a single road,
Yeah.
with his flanks exposed, and attempting to make 62 miles in 2 to 3 days. And he had also suspicion that the lack of German opposition was not quite as lacking as Montgomery's staff were making it out.
They were laying in wait.
Right. Now, the problem is the Russians.
Sorry, Mike, which general was that?
But that was Brian Horrocks. I mean, he went ahead and did it. That was his job. He was the commander of 30 Corps. He was a great general. But he said, you know, he thought that was a problem. As he said, he didn't think it was going to be the walkover everybody else thought it was going to be. But the Russians didn't learn from that in Ukraine. That's one example, because they had a supply column stretched and stopped. Whether they were stopped because of their own logistical problems, or they were stopped by Ukrainian forces, but they were there for how long?
It was 40 miles sitting there for days.
Right. You don't have a single axis of advance unless you're absolutely sure you can keep that moving and get it to the point quickly. This is something that he should have learned from not only Market Garden. There were other examples of that it wasn't a good, the way he did it showed that they hadn't learned anything from history, even their own history in some cases.
Right.
And as far as MacArthur and both Patton, this whole idea of blustering through, what Americans love to do. I mean, we've heard, Gary, who has presented this idea that we could have invaded German-occupied Europe in 1942 instead of 44, which I totally disagree with, but he's done some, a lot of work putting that together. But the idea is that we can just bluster and bash our way through, and just, we have the guts and we have the power, and we could just push our way through. Well, this is something that was usually an American failing, but Putin fell right into it as well. He just thought he was going to bash on through the Ukrainians, and he didn't realize that even an underwhelming force, at least compared to his, could put up enough of a defense to destroy that strategy. And apparently Putin doesn't really have a plan B. I mean, he's got a plan B in that he said, okay, I'll just lay siege to these cities and blow the hell out of them. But it wasn't a very viable, it's not a very viable military plan B. So I just wonder what, in other words, Putin is basically acting like one of these kind of, to put it mildly, naive American type of theories where you could just, we'll just kick ass and kick them out of the way, and you just go through, and it'll be that overwhelming shock and awe that'll just knock them out of the way. Well, when you're in somebody else's country, that shock and awe doesn't really hold water, because you're invading their country. You're not really giving them any choice but to do everything they can but to stop you. I mean, did he actually think that Ukraine was going to just basically cave in and say, okay, well, we'll just be part of Russia right now? That was one massive miscalculation. But the fact is, he's on somebody else's soil. He's in somebody else's country, and he thinks he's just going to, shock him into just, giving up and letting him through, or who knows what he was thinking. That's what we're trying to figure out right now. But the fact is that if we go to history, if we go to the history of these types of operations, you don't do something where, it's like in the United States, everybody thinks like, you always go for the long shot. The long shot will always come in. It's this kind of Hollywood vision of like, the guy puts all his money on one horse or on the Irish sweepstakes or whatever, and in one little business, far-fetched business venture, and it all comes out great, and they wind up in a happy, Frank Capra-esque type of, happily ever after type of ending. Yeah, that happens occasionally, but only occasionally. That's why they call them long shots. Statistically, at least, it's not going to happen that often. And you don't put all your eggs in that basket. You don't put all your money on that one horse. There's no sense of moderation there. And Putin has basically done, again, this is predominantly a failing that's normally associated with Americans. But Putin, it seems like he may have been as influenced, ridiculous, even though he was was probably one of the architects of, or one of the, maybe Trump's puppet master. But the fact is, then he in turn was influenced by Trump's success, or temporary success, in this kind of, almost naive, unrealistic, almost counter-realistic idea that, if you just bash on through, you're going to win the day and everything will turn out rosy. That's what's unusual about Putin's choice.
Okay, Mike, take a break. I want to go back to what I was talking with you before. I was going to ask this to make it more difficult as a Jeopardy question, but instead, it's to Mike. Well, let me make it a simpler question. Who am I omitting from this list of people who could play Putin when the movie comes out? Russell Crowe, Sam Rockwell, Matt Damon, Christian Bale, Jack Nicholson, Mel Gibson, Tim Roth, Oscar Isaac, Gary Oldman. Who should play Putin?
None of them. They're great Russian actors. Pick one of them.
Oh, name two.
Well, I'll name you one, but he's dead. And one of the greatest actors ever lived was Inokente Smoktanovsky, who played Hamlet or something. He could have certainly played Putin. Unfortunately, he can't anymore because he's deceased.
But you know like 3 or 4 people who could pronounce his name, right?
Well, I know plenty of people from Russia and Ukraine that can pronounce it. As a matter of fact, I'm under the impression that Smoktanovsky was part Ukrainian also. But
Oh.
I may be wrong about that. I don't really know his background. Just know he was a brilliant actor during the Soviet era, and even in the post-Soviet era, he was still working. But he passed away, I believe, in the late 90s.
Okay, so they just showed the arrogance of a typical American like me. I wouldn't even think of a Russian actor to play a Russian character. I just came up with all these Hollywood types, Hollywood people.
Most Hollywood producers would not think of it either, so don't worry about it, Ken.
Right.
No, I think though, when it comes to, I mean, we're kind of jumping the gun a little bit as far as who's going to play Putin. First, we have to deal with Putin, the real person, as opposed to the cinematic version of him. That comes. Who knows what the historical analysis of this situation will be, although we see it developing. Another point that I want to get back to is, and a question I want to bring up is that, because Steve, you said that, Putin was hoping to get all these plutocrats on his side and all these plutocratic governments, but even China has not really been, they've been lukewarm. And again, China's looking out for China, so I understand that. But, that's pretty much failed. Yeah, I mean, he's got, the Syrian government on his side. All right, that and $2.75 will get you on the New York City subway system. But he really has in other words, he didn't get all these plutocrats to rally around him. So my question is, what is his motivation? What is his plan now? If that's, in other words, going with that idea, with Steve's idea about that. And that'd be my question to Steve and everybody, including Dennis, whom I would like to hear from, and who could possibly
Hey,
change
Frank's
that.
joined us.
And Frank.
Let's go to, let
hi.
Frank listen for a while, and then we'll go to him. Frank, we're talking about Putin and his mad delusions of grandeur. Let's go to Dennis and then to Frank. Dennis, unmute.
Excuse me, Mike did ask me a question.
Okay, hey, go ahead, Steve.
Which is, what does Putin do now? And that's a very good question. And I don't think, Putin is obviously just trying to maintain the war. He's starting to, in certain areas, apparently starting to lose. Not in the big scale, but there was one suburb of Kiev that they had to leave. And he's on the ground. He is certainly rapidly losing members of the general staff. That is becoming. There've been some reporting on that, but if we weren't getting reporting, it would have to be happening, because the way he's organized this thing has led to this right now a stalemate where all he's doing is literally destroying cities in Ukraine, which is going to reflect very badly on Russia for decades. So the question is, which I raised before, but to answer Mike's question, and I don't know, but I don't think that he's going to leave voluntarily. And the question is, if he's leaving involuntarily, how is that going to be accomplished in Russia? And,
Okay.
It could be by violence. It could be by physical removal. It could be by reasoning, although this man doesn't seem to reason too well. It could be by a guarantee of a very nice, comfortable, protected environment, even within Russia or without. But I'll get back to a little news item that I cited at the beginning. There was a man, I'm blocking his name now, who was the principal advisor to Yeltsin, Jankowitz, I think. He was the principal advisor to Yeltsin, and some authorities think that, are we getting a picture here of Mike?
No.
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 And there are people who think that he came up with the idea of creating this group of so-called oligarchs who would control the Russian economy. And maybe a little later, I'll talk about the column that I published today on what happened, why Russia did not become a conventional capitalist economy, which it could have been, could have become. This man, he left Russia yesterday. He was very influential in the 1990s. He was high up in the Putin government. He left. He was seen in Istanbul getting money out of a cash machine. I guess, I don't know, he's got a credit card that still works. So if this guy left, that indicates to me that there are a whole bunch of other people who are either going to leave to save their own skin, or they're going to try to organize a coup in one way or another. My final thought on this is the invasion of Ukraine and the perpetual destruction of Ukraine, which is going on, is not going to end until Putin is either removed from the scene or leaves the scene. I don't think there's any other way for this to end.
Okay. All right. Well, Dennis. Oh, Dennis, you're back. Can you unmute and update us on Putin? What you think about Putin? Do you think Putin will survive, or will he be pushed out? Putin gets pushed out.
I basically don't know.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't have that kind of information, but I do know that he was pushed into the invasion by the U.S. failure to negotiate with him. That's what I'll say. And I think that the way the situation is going now is a happy situation for Biden and the military-industrial complex in the United States. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So we should go bullish on Boeing and who's ever making the bullets and the bombs.
Everybody's doing that right now.
Right.
And
Okay.
also on the liquid natural gas coming out of the United States.
Okay. Good. Okay. Hey, Frank, can you come in on Putin? You there, Frank? There we
Yeah,
go. Go ahead.
Here it comes.
I came up with an analogy. Rather than go into the painful granular details of what's going on in the campaign at the moment, if you look at war as it's happened up until now, without the involvement of potentially nuclear powers, it's like two crabs going at each other, and they dance around and they maneuver and they do their utmost to annihilate the other. And this is throughout history, and essentially one may be bigger than the other, one is smarter than the other. But what Putin has now,
Whoops! I hit your. I muted you by accident. Unmute, Frank. Sorry.
well, where was I? Well, what he's
Go ahead. What Putin has now.
the analogy of the crabs. Well, anyway, what he has now is a scorpion. A scorpion in which, even if the claws are fragile, and that's demonstrated, we see consistently all throughout this operation, this special military operation. What he has is a stinger, which of course is his either chemical or technique or worse. That's the escalation. So it's very dangerous to fight a scorpion, even if you can handle his claws. You'd like to be able to go for his head, but if you go for his head, he's likely to use his stinger. And the problem is with the Russian people, they're like the body of the scorpion in that they're under a shield of propaganda that they cannot break out of. They are under state control, which is unfortunate in the extreme. I mean, China is even worse probably. So they cannot really do much about overthrowing Putin, as it seems at the moment. So bad as what they're doing, and it's clear that the Ukrainian army can, in fact, disable one of the claws, the one around Kiev, but is failing around Mariupol. The end result may be that, Putin is not the irrational person some people think, because as we saw when he was negotiating with Macron or anybody, he used the long Mad Hatter table, right? That was deliberate. He's showing that he can use the stinger, in other words, of this scorpion body, this analogy, at any time, and you cannot guarantee that he will or he won't. Whereas when he was with Bennett from Israel, or obviously with Xi Jinping, he's up close and there's a normalcy about him. So what he's trying, what he's projecting to the West, particularly Biden and NATO, is that he has this new modus operandi, which is very scary. And the problem is with Russia is the way the way it is at the moment, with him in charge and his Security Council, is that Russia is, from his point of view, like a layered cake. It's historically layered. And some layers, unfortunately, get the wrong end of the stick. They get the sacrificial layer in order to keep this wonderful thing called Russia succeeding in the world. And I think he's saying that this particular generation of Russians may be sacrificed for the good of the greater good, which of course he determines, right? So this is a very scary phenomenon. And we may see it, this stinger, used against Mariupol if it doesn't fall within the next few days. Because basically the Ukrainians are dismantling one of his claws, essentially. I mean, you can take the analogy a bit too ridiculous, okay? But they are succeeding against his army in such a way that he may have to demonstrate how lethal this sort of way of doing things that has no precedent, right? And if he wins here, not only will it be obviously the devastation of eastern Ukraine, which it's devastated now, and the agriculture is going, there's no planting probably, so it's going to have impacts worldwide. But the danger is that he's not necessarily going to stop. Depends how, it all depends on our reaction. And I think Biden is between a rock and a hard place right now. He absolutely wanted to end the forever war, 2 guys dying every year. He's in a completely different place now. A lot is resting on Biden, and I've said this before, I'm not sure he's up to it. So essentially, I don't see Putin as being a megalomaniac nut job. I think he's a megalomaniac sane person. So that's very scary. I mean, you listen to Peskov, he was saying, if there's an existential threat to us, we'll do something. Well, that existential threat could be, not just Mariupol holding out, but also a ability of the Ukrainians to strike back. Now, it may not happen if the Belarusians come in. If the Belarusians come in, that may tip the scale against the Ukrainians around Kiev, if they come in. Now, Tikhonovskaya, the opposition to Lukashenko on Hard Talk a while back, said that the Belarusian army was not willing to cross the border. But that was about 2 weeks ago, and I suspect that Lukashenko and his security apparatus have weeded out those people who are against that. So the Belarusian army may have been cleansed and ready to go. So rather than use the stinger, still with the scorpion analogy, I think they're going to use the Belarusians, maybe, because they just kicked out all the, I think the ambassador from Ukraine, I think.
Well, may I interrupt for a moment, Frank? If the Belarusian army is as competent as the Russian army, they may not provide too much assistance.
I agree, but nevertheless, it's You know, it's a border that's close to Lviv. They may, I mean, they just may add further weight to, you know, to well, certainly reversing the advances of the Ukrainian army, which is doing very well. Now, the thing is that the Ukrainian army has reached a point, a threshold point, where not only are they much more adept at this form of war than Russia can handle, they're also expanding. I mean, they're probably around about 300,000 now. And this is far more than what the Russians have got on in the field, far more.
Really?
So, yes, much more. I mean, the Russians they started with 190, let's say they went up to 200,000. Of that, only about, I would say, 50,000 are basically a sort of stormtrooper type. I mean, they're very good, but they've lost so many that if the Ukrainian army is well led, and I think it is, if it understands that it can't stop and that it must maintain the momentum, especially around Kiev, and it must not stop, then there could be massive reverses, especially around Kiev. However, if they become the least bit complacent, and this is always a problem, they've got to understand that they're going to take a lot of casualties. That's what they've got to accept. And this is the hard thing for any army to accept. I mean, once they accept that, then they're going to start winning decisively in that area. That's why the Belarusians are important from the Russian point of view, because they know this. It's all a time crunch right now. The longer the Mariupol lasts, the worse it gets for the Russians. That's why he may use the Stinger and actually employ nukes. Not nukes, but certainly chemicals first. I mean, there's an escalation thing later. I think the Belarusians actually, the army may be an interim before the next step. So that's my take on it.
Ken, you're unmute. Ken, you're muted.
There you go. You know, I am married, so I'm used to it. Steve, you got any response?
Well, I don't have a specific response. I think the commentary from both Frank and Mike was very, very well informed, in great depth, and I think very useful. I put out another speculative column yesterday about what I think is the true cause of what's happened in Russia and of Russian policy today, the invasion of Ukraine, but a lot of other policies, initiatives that they've taken. It's very common among the left, and I'm sure you folks see as much of their left-wing commentary as I do, to blame this all on NATO, and to blame this all on the promises that were made in the early 90s that NATO would not move eastward, that were broken, and that's absolutely true. There were guarantees given first to the failing Soviet Union and then to Russia that NATO would not expand eastward. And of course, those promises were all broken with Poland, with Latvia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and so on and so forth. I don't think that's why Putin invaded Ukraine. I don't think the invasion of Ukraine has anything to do with NATO, and whether Ukraine would join NATO or not. I don't see how it's not going to happen now, obviously, because that's one thing that Ukraine is going to have to give up if they're ever going to get the Russians out of their hair and then start rebuilding, which is going to cost billions. I don't know where that money's going to come from. And then, of course, a lot of Ukrainians have been killed, et cetera, et cetera. But they're going to have to make a guarantee not to join NATO. I don't think that would make any difference to Russia. Russia's already surrounded by NATO, or Belarus is between Russia and certain of the NATO members, but they're surrounded. So what if Ukraine is in NATO? You mean southern flank? That makes a difference? I don't think that is how the United States and the Western powers caused the situation that we have now. I think how the United States, and specifically, and the Western powers, and I think a lot more research has to be done on this, and it may have been. I looked for some. I briefly, I didn't do a huge, in-depth search for this. When the Soviet Union fell, the logical progression. Well, first of all, it broke up, but the major country in it is what has become Russia. It was the Russian Federated Soviet Socialist Republic. It's the biggest republic in the old Soviet Union, and a major country with major industrial resources. Obviously, they started building up in the 30s, and Stalin, for all his fault, and he had them. But in the early 1930s, Stalin said, we have 10 years to get ready because the West is going to be coming after us in 10 years. And guess what? That's exactly what happened on June 22nd, 1941. And they built up this incredible industrial capacity to the east of the Urals. And then they continued building industrial capacity, of course, after the war. They were held back because of all the losses that they did occur on the western side of the Urals. They were held back because, very specifically, the United States did not include the Soviet Union in the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan money went entirely to Western Europe, particularly to Germany, to rebuild Germany and German industry as quickly as possible to face against who? The Soviet Union. So there is evidence, and I've certainly read about this. I think that it's supported by documentation. Stalin, at the end of the war, Stalin thought that there was going to be peaceful coexistence, that he was going to be able to actually build socialism in one country, which is the issue that separated him from Trotsky right from the beginning. Trotsky, of course, said you can't build socialism in one country, and guess what? Trotsky was right. But Stalin thought that he could. He thought he was going to have peaceful coexistence, and it very quickly turned against him. The Soviet Union continued to develop industrial capacity, but there were several big buts. A big but for the Soviet Union was how the industrial capacity was organized. Each particular industrial sector had a ministry in Moscow, and they reported in vertical lines to the ministry in Moscow. And out in the in the districts, you could have a factory producing a certain thing that needed raw materials from a factory nearby that produced those raw materials. The one factory could not communicate directly with the next factory. It had to go up the line to the ministry in Moscow, across to the other ministry in Moscow, and then down the line. I mean, it had an intensely cumbersome organization of industrial production. And of course, it had a very primitive form of retail distribution. We also, the pictures of the lines at the bread stores in Moscow at the end of the Soviet Union. So, but they did have this very big industrial base. And they also had a big retail base. It was just very poorly organized. So the logical thing at that point would have been it seems to me anyway, and I made this observation in a column I published yesterday. The logical thing would have been to help the Russians to organize a Western-style economy, and of course I'm very familiar with all the limitations of capitalism. I know that, but one thing capitalism can do is it can produce product. And it can organize and it can distribute. And it would have been logical for the West to have done that. And also to make sure that a new constitution in Russia would establish an independent government system, hopefully with separation of powers like to a greater or lesser extent that the Western democracies do. Bourgeois, I understand that, Dennis, if you're listening, bourgeois democracies, I understand that very well, and I've written a lot on that subject. That's what would have made sense. Now, what would that have produced over time? What that would have produced over time is a presumably powerful capitalist country existing in Russia with all the natural resources that Russia has. That is, in my view, is the last thing that the Western powers wanted. That's why the Harvard boys were sent in. That's why the drunk Yeltsin was the president for 8 years. That's why this guy Chubais was his principal, who left yesterday, was his principal advisor. And what they established was this oligarchic system of government, which Putin has aggrandized more and more power to his person. And I described this yesterday as what they have is they have a feudalist system with a king, a monarch, one person sitting on at the top, surrounded by a bunch of dukes who were the oligarchs who were in charge of this business or that business, out of which they make a tremendous amount of personal income. You can imagine the exploitation of the Russian workers that's going on if somebody could buy a motor yacht for $675,000. That's a lot of money. That's a pretty big boat.
Excuse me. 675 million, not thousand.
Is that right? Or
Well, you don't buy a yacht for $500,000. That's maybe okay for Marina Del Rey.
Yeah,
no.
675 million. It's a very big ship.
Right, million.
Right. Yeah, 670. Actually, I used to be a sailor. I still get Cruising World. For $675,000 today, you get, like a
thank you.
Well, no, you can get a very nicely finished 50-foot, sloop.
Right.
So, yeah, but I mean, I'm speculating here, but I think that this system was set up purposefully to avoid making the former Soviet Union into a major capitalist power, which is a capitalist country with the organization, the financing, the distribution, and certainly all is the exploitation, et cetera. But look at Germany. Look at this country. We produce a lot of stuff. There are tremendous, oppression and differences in income. Of course there are, but we're very productive. And significant chunks of the population live from fairly well to reasonably well.
Steve, aren't you describing China?
China's different. I don't know how long you want me to go. I mean, Mike went on for a very long time, so I might go on a little longer. But let me just finish on Russia, then I'll make it very short on China. So that's how I think the U.S. influence in the early 90s. We ended up with what is a modern feudalist system with a king surrounded by dukes. And this king can get rid of any of the dukes anytime he wanted to. It was like Henry VIII. I don't know if Putin's had 6 wives. I think he's had a couple. Um, and just, offer this head. And that's what we've gotten. And then I think this is I think I suggested in the earlier column why Putin did the invasion. So I think that's what we've got. It's a modern feudalism. That's what I think it is. Sitting on top of 400 nuclear weapons, very dangerous. As far as China is concerned, very quickly, I think really everybody around the table knows this. What happened in China was that China had and has a ruling class just like every other country does. And as the end of the 1970s approached, a significant chunk of the Chinese ruling class realized that they were not going to get anywhere in industrial development to compete with the West, and certainly, with enemies, did not get along well with Russia, but they were particularly concerned about the United States. They were not going to get anywhere with the kind of industrial development they had if it remained entirely in the hands of the Communist Party, and that's where Deng Xiaoping came in. He was called the capitalist voter, and he started the parallel development of a capitalist sector within an overall socialist republic that eventually led to what China is today. Now, 2 years ago at the Party Congress, which in my view made a huge mistake by giving Xi Jinping a lifetime tenure. But at that same Party Congress, it was decided that the capitalist sector, which has done enormously well for China, I mean, you look at these Chinese cities, oh my gosh, that never would have happened in a purely socialist economy. That they've gone too far, they've gotten out of control, and they have to be brought back under control. We don't know what's happening in that, and of course, everything in China has been influenced by COVID, just as it has in every other country in the world. But China did, it's not original to say China has a thoroughly mixed economy, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that balance. I mean, that last Party Congress said this, in essence, the balance has to be reverted to having more socialism, less capitalism. But we'll have to see how that's done. I don't think that it is a good idea for them to have made Xi essentially president for life, because then there's no room for other ideas. And we've seen what happened in the old Soviet Union with that. We've seen what's happened in Russia with that. If the Republicans get in 24, we're going to see what happens in this country with that. So I think that's a view that they have to figure out a better way to balance the socialist part of the economy with the capitalist part of the economy. But you don't do that by eliminating democracy at the top. They don't have, they don't have a parliamentary system. They don't have separation of powers. They don't have an independent judiciary. But within that context, you don't get to any kind of last point. In modern complex societies, decisions that work are going to be made by people exchanging ideas back and forth without being worried that a particular idea that they put forth is going to land them in jail. And China is moving in that direction.
Can I just chime in here? I'll preface this by saying that, Steve, you said that, mentioned that I talked a very long time, but there's a difference between my talking a long time and your talking a long time, which is that during much of the time I was talking, I wasn't really saying anything. Nothing worthwhile, in my opinion. But,
well, Mike, if you'll pardon me, I have to disagree with you. Very kind of you to say that, but I have to disagree with you. I found what you had to say very interesting and very informative.
Well, there's always one. But anyway, but I'll try to be more succinct this time because there are two interesting points. One is the fact that, and Frank brought up the Stinger, which is the chemical and/or tactical nuclear. Forgetting about the strategic nuclear strategic nuclear use. But I mean, already in Finland, recently, prior to this Ukrainian situation, the war in Ukraine, Finland was about, I think it was 30 some odd percent of the, according to polls, and we all know how accurate polls are, but according to the polls, POLLS.
Yes.
Yeah,
We can get to the other ones later, Mike.
right. That's a whole different thing. But according to the polls in Finland, about 30, 35, give or take 1 or 2%, about 35% favored joining NATO. It's now up to 60% of the country, according to the same polls, apparently, favored joining NATO. If Putin would have used tactical nukes or chemical weapons, in this case, probably more likely chemical, I think that would go up to probably 80 or 90%.
Mike,
so,
I think you're wrong on that number. I think it would go up to 110%.
okay, well, all right. So I'm being a little overcautious there. But the fact is that, yeah, that would be, in other words, that would just be basically the, throwing good money after bad on Putin's part. He already has now for the next 3 generations, I believe, a hostile country, Ukraine, on his southern border. Even if he took it over, the Ukrainians would still think of themselves as a country, as still being a nation. And so he has that hostile group or nation, whatever he wants to call it, on that wasn't nearly as hostile before, that is far more hostile in the south. And then he will have people clamoring to get into NATO on his western borders, those that aren't in it already. The problem that we have here, and this is the great dilemma. Putin has the ability, as does the United States, to wipe out, basically, eliminate life from this planet as we know it. If he keeps on, I mean, he's kind of, I don't want to say he's been blatantly doing it, or not that blatantly, but he's kind of raised that specter as a possibility. Of course, that was mitigated to some point by other of his, representatives who said, well, that's if there was an existential threat to Russia, which, by the way, Ukraine never was. But the fact is that, what do we do? I mean, this is the big question, and nobody's been able to answer it. If somebody's willing to say, I'm going to invade this country, and I'm going to take over, and I'm going to do whatever I want to it, and if you try to stop me, I'm going to start using nukes or WMDs, and chemical weapons are WMDs, as are biological agents. I'm just going to use them. What happens when people say, I don't care? I mean, it just becomes blatant, like, a Trump style situation where he says, I'm going to do whatever I feel like doing and whatever I want to do. And if you try to stop me, I'm just going to, blow everything up or just eliminate everything. Like, it's basically the 3-year-old's attitude on how to deal with the world, or, or at least a kindergartner. So I'll go up to kindergarten level, which is, I want when I want. And if I don't get it, I'm just going to, destroy it, knock all the blocks over. What do we do with that type of situation? It's, it's almost, how do we stop it? I mean, if somebody has the power, if, let's say, Hitler or Japan would have come up with nuclear weapons, or an arsenal of nuclear weapons in the Second World War, what the hell would we have done? We would have tried to take out the nuclear weapons somehow. But in essence, we're faced with an existential dilemma here, where one side is willing to say, I'm going to do whatever I want to achieve whatever I want. I'm going to, there's no gloves off. I'm just going to, if I can't get what I want, everything goes to hell. And I mean, I understand.
Okay, let's go to Frank and let's see if he's got an alternative plan.
Well, no, that's a question for all of us.
Okay, well, let's go to Frank. He hasn't spoken in a while.
All right. Well, I mean, yes, the dilemma is there. Of course, he advertised the inability of us to counter his hypersonic MiG-31s with their Kinzels. And although we've made a point, we, the United States, made the point that we can track them. So it's not necessarily so that we may not be able to intercept them. They are maneuverable, but from what I understand, we can't. And that's pretty much across the, that's the consensus. So this new modus operandi where he's willing to absolutely destroy those who oppose. This is different from Stalin. Stalin was never out to, he was out to wipe out an enemy, no question about that, but you should gain from war. And he did gain from war. You take over the other side's industries. You take all their machine tools, and that's why there was Sputnik. These things show that you can gain from war, because he didn't build strategic bombers. He didn't really bomb strategically. We did, but the Soviet Union did not. And so at the end of the day, he acquired territory. He acquired a lot of stuff that Soviet Union prior to was an economic basket case, actually. But after the sacrifices that the 27 million made, they had the Warsaw Pact, and they stripped it clean pretty much from most of Eastern Germany, so that Russian industry would flourish to a point. But of course, there were the limitations of central planning. This is different. What Putin is doing makes no sense from that perspective. This is just destruction and killing to prove a point, which is nonsensical. There is that analogy you might make that it's like, it's like a playground bully. The Ukrainian guy who was intimidated is bitch slapping him all over the playground, but everybody knows that he's carrying a loaded 45. This is the bully. So what's he going to do at some point? If he starts crying, everybody take to the hills, So here we have a situation where there's no outcome that has been actually stipulated by anybody on that side, other than the complete demilitarization, never accept NATO, never to be accepted into NATO, and essentially a neutered country. It's not even Finland. It's not a Finlandization. It's actually a subjugated country is the only outcome that is acceptable to Putin at this point. This does not augur well. I mean, there may be a calculation on their part that because the initial stage of this operation went so badly, that because Germany has suddenly said, okay, we'll go to 2% of GDP on defense, that if they're going to act now and retake what they've lost as the former Soviet Union, this is the only time they can do it, which because they've got nukes essentially. I'm not seeing any logic here. That's the problem. So you've got the horns of a dilemma if you're Biden and NATO, because every time Ukraine succeeds in doing something, you get closer to the point where you might use, as I said this before, the stinger. So you lose if you succeed, and if you lose, you win if you. There's no successful outcome. So I am not quite sure what the general staff of the Russian Stavka is thinking right now. There's got to be a von Stauffenberg out there. There absolutely has to be, who quietly takes the guy out at some point. That's all I can say. I mean, this is getting to be absurd, and I think Xi Jinping is worried. Was initially worried that this didn't go right. Then was worried that this didn't seem to make sense. But now I'm not quite sure, because wait a minute. If there's an obliteration thing going on in the West, yeah, economically it's not going to be good for China, but China's going to be sitting pretty at some point. That's another issue. I mean, if he thinks like that, then we got he could be the arbitrator. He can assist in negotiations, but he's not doing that either. So I don't know what the answer is with Xi Jinping either.
I just wanted to throw something in here. We're going to stick on this for the rest of the night. I had another topic. We'll do it next week. But any use of nuclear weapons, and to any scale, if there's fallout, if it isn't some kind of a thing where it blows up off the surface and just creates physical damage, any kind of radioactive fallout anywhere in Eastern Europe or in China or in Russia or Ukraine or any Tajikistan, anywhere in the Asia or Europe, contaminates the entire continent. You don't get to occupy the Ukraine if you drop atomic weapons in it. It's contaminated, and like Chernobyl, it depends how many you drop. So therefore, the typical scenario with mutual assured destruction is between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and so forth. Well, I'll drop bombs in the Western Hemisphere, not in the Eastern Hemisphere. Any kind of and of course, if everybody lets loose with everything, it's nuclear winter. However, just using tactical weapons, you're just, like you said, Stalin wants to acquire occupation and the resources of some territory he acquires. This is just like sacking an area or contaminating it. It's pointless. You're killing your own population if you drop a bomb in the Ukraine. Well, it's right there. It's going to come right over to Russia, the radioactive fallout. And also, you're going to lose the food that's generated by the Ukraine, which is the, quote, breadbasket of Europe and Asia. So you're killing yourself. It's suicide. And likewise with China, if they destroyed the market, the people that are buying things, so they can make billions of dollars and come over here and buy our companies and real estate. But they have to have our population working like a dedicated slave to absorb their commodities and give them our money, however economy works. So it's a similar thing. Kill the market? Why would you kill the market? So I'm not saying, I understand a madman can do anything, and like the famous Batman quote, some people like to watch the world burn, and so forth. So he could be crazy, he could be a psychopath, but there's no strategic reason for him to use nuclear weapons, only to threaten. Because of that, because you're adjacent to each other. I just wanted you to now prove me wrong or tell me where I'm wrong. Go ahead, Frank.
Oh,
No, let Steve go.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead, Steve.
let me make a last comment before I tail off here.
Okay.
I think that this this excellent discussion that we've had illustrates that, at least to me, the solution to the Putin-Ukraine problem is not going to come from the outside. It's not going to come from NATO. It's not going to come from the United States. It is China. China could be a huge help here, but they're apparently not willing to do that. One major reason for them is they don't like the use of sanctions. So because they're afraid that the sanctions could be turned on them at some point. So I think the solution to this problem, and I hope it comes soon, is going to come from inside Russia. I think that I'm hoping that there is more than one General Milley at the highest levels of the Russian command system. Remember that we found out that after January 6th, that General Milley, I think he made the call that he called his opposite number in the People's Republic of China and assured them, I mean, it didn't come out this way, but I'm sure he did assure them, no, we're not going to let this jackass start a nuclear war. We're absolutely not going. He may have the nuclear football. We're going to take the air out of it. And hopefully that's what's going to happen in Russia, that the general staff is going to get together, or powerful elements of the general staff are going to get together. They may bring in some of the oligarchs who want to save their own skins and their own money. But I see that as the only way that Putin is going to be removed from the scene, either peacefully or unpeacefully. So that's my comment, and I'm going, as I usually depart around this hour, I am going to depart. Sorry I missed you all next week. Sorry I missed you all next week. Oh my God. Hey, that's what happens when you get as old as I am. Sorry I missed you all last week. I was really not feeling well, but I'm feeling much better. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Okay, well, thank you for your attendance.
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Steve.
I agree. It's got to be from within. If it's going to be anybody, it's got to be somebody with some sanity in there and a lot of guts.
Well, yeah, well, I would agree with that also. That it's going to have to come. I mean, let's face it. You know, we were talking last week about Biden's approval rating on the war or something. Biden's approval rating and really the United States is actually peripheral to this, except for what the United States can provide to Ukraine. The war is between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting them back. We in the West are, you know, the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Poland, to various degrees. Japan also are their support. By the way, speaking of Japan, Russia has stopped the negotiations on the World War II. The complex, still political complex about the islands that was from the end of World War II. They were still negotiating with Japan about that, and they stopped negotiations on that. Not that that's going to make much of a difference, but basically everybody in the West is relatively peripheral, as you know, and again to varying degrees. But it's going to have to come somewhere between Ukraine and Moscow, you know, between Kiev and Moscow, and again, I agree with Frank. Somebody's going to, both Frank and Steve, you know, somebody's going to have to take the air out of Putin's nuclear football, and somebody's going to have to say if they, you know, if you don't have a von Stauffenberg situation, which of course will be difficult because Putin has made his table a lot longer. So it's hard to put a suitcase right next to him.
Yeah. But he's got to eat. He's got to go. He's got to use the bathroom. He's got to, you know, clean himself. He's got to take a shower, and so forth.
Yeah,
but
There's
I'm sure
opportunity.
I'm sure he's got his tasters, just like Hitler did. But the idea is that again, there's other ways to get rid of him. Like I was saying before, you got saying, Vlad, you got all this money. It's just gonna, why don't you get out while it's still worth something, or something in between those two. But I really don't know. I really don't know what the negotiating position is. And I mean, I was hoping for negotiations, but Zelensky can't start giving up territory because he's got his people behind him for very good reasons. They're very fond of him, but they would probably less fond if he started giving up chunks of Ukraine. I'm not talking Donbas region, but pieces of Ukraine that don't want to be given up. So I don't know. It's a difficult situation, but I agree that the solution is going to have to come from Ukraine and Russia.
Okay, let's get to Dennis. Dennis is not muted, and here he is, and here he comes. Dennis, do you think someone in Russia will help us by, sending Putin on to his just rewards?
I really don't know.
You don't know.
I have to say I don't know.
Well, your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to travel over there and give him an upset stomach so he kicks off.
No, I really don't know what's going to happen. I think it's unlikely that nuclear weapons will be used, but if they're used, we're in trouble. And that's it.
Okay. Okay.
By the way, that
Well-
was probably the most honest answer that I've heard all night, which is by saying, I don't know, because none of us really do.
Yeah. Okay, so how about if we just come to a conclusion tonight instead of like pushing it to the absolute end? Okay. Frank,
we
do you want to
haven't-
say anything before we leave? Go ahead.
Well, we haven't used, I mean, there's a calibrated way of using these WDMDs. They could start small. I mean, there's a escalation ladder, right? So they start small, they may use chlorine, just chlorine. Then they may graduate to sarin. And then they can always start using a more serious form of cyber warfare, which, whether or not they attack the United States, that could be part of whatever quid pro quo kind of thing that goes on in this escalation. And that could get interesting. But, we put the sanctions on them. So, in their own logic, it's like, well, they can retaliate in certain ways.
Yeah, there's another thing with nuclear. Depleted uranium contaminated much of Laos and South Vietnam. The shells from in Iraq, depleted uranium, and maybe also in Vietnam because it was used in some of the napalm shells. I think, giving you a field using depleted uranium or uranium to create
not in
like a
Vietnam.
barrier or mines, landmines.
Well, I think the burn pits were the problem in Iraq because that's the big contaminant. As far as depleted uranium, only when you actually penetrate a tank is the depleted uranium going to be, is there going to be a residue? Yeah, I mean, and it's only where those tanks are. So I'm not sure about this idea that there's many casualties from it. But anyway.
But the point you're making is valid. There's a gradient of weapons of mass destruction. It's weapons of significant destruction and so forth.
They can use airburst with low yield airburst over, say, Mariupol. And then that could be what that does in terms of our side saying, okay, we will negotiate right now, whether Zelensky likes it or not. The pressure, I think, will be almost at a panic level in the West, and I think that's possibly what Putin is. That's his trump card. The panic level will be of such an order of magnitude in the streets that it's like anything would be agreed upon practically. And then Lavrov will be sitting there smugly saying, well, okay, you don't have to demilitarize everything, but basically you have to move west of the Dnieper River, everything, and just we'll let all the army go provided they lay down their arms, something like that. I mean, this is the kind of threat that I think would be hard to counter, because the West has been complacent for so long. But we don't do duck and cover stuff at school. Nobody takes the whole mad thing seriously, and hasn't for decades. So psychologically, the average man in the street hasn't even thought about this, and why should they? And what's going on in Ukraine is just so bizarre, and it is. But if they were suddenly to do it, there would be many on the left and the right who would say, let's just agree to practically everything. And then, we were talking about, should we fall for the appeasement thing before this thing started? Well, we didn't. And that was good. Well, the Neville Chamberlains may come out in their droves if Putin uses a nuke and start saying, well, we can come out of this honorably. Not really, but we'll say anything to get this thing to stop. And so, that's why I'm hoping that doesn't happen. But that may be a calculation on the part of Putin and his cronies. And that's scary.
There's also one other thing we haven't taken into account, which is that if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon, Putin, in Ukraine, he's got to use it in a way so that it's not going to kill an enormous number of his own troops, or even make them sick enough so that their fighting ability is heavily impaired. So that's another option.
I think you can do that, actually. If it's an airburst with a low yield, you can almost make it tailored to whatever the target is, which would be what I'm really talking about, Mariupol, or Kharkiv, or maybe Sumy, but definitely Mariupol. If you do it right, obviously your troops would back off, knowing that it was coming in, a few thousand yards, and then you put it in there, and then that place is no longer habitable for quite a while, and there's nobody left there, and it's over. It's over. And then you've got this fait accompli in the world. And they're just like, everybody will be just like, what just happened? And then they might be able to exploit that at the negotiating table. That's what I'm kind of.
What is the fallout capability of a TAC nuke? Something that would be able to, let's say, airburst and destroy Mariupol.
Not too bad. It's not too bad. It's not too bad. I mean, yeah, probably the center of the city, within a radius of about 1,000 yards, would be contaminated. But if it's an airburst, that should be it. I mean, obviously, you do not want this thing to land on the ground, and then you're going to throw that up, and then it's a ground burst is the worst thing you can do. I mean, I don't know how finely tuned the Russian stuff is, but American bombs can be very low. You sort of they've got a means of reducing it or increasing it on the actual weapon itself. So probably the Russians have too. I mean, they spent a lot of money on this over the time the Soviet Union was in existence. And so why not use it? That's probably the argument of that side of the general staff in Russia. Now, there's another side saying this is nuts and insane, but who's in the commanding, who's in, well, the other problem, which I mentioned previously, is the mentality of the generals and senior officers, I'm suspecting, is a little bit more gangster than in the American Army or NATO. There's an Al Capone thing going on where it's almost like the SS, a brutal SS guy who may have gone through extermination camps and then ended up in the regular, the fighting SS. He's got a sort of respect within that organization, and has no qualms about being brutal at all. I mean, I'm only saying that because of that one example where the guy had 2 grenades in his hands and was negotiating with a town. I think it was Kherson. That kind of person is scary, but it also is suggestive that there's got a kind of gangster kind of party, gang boss, gangland kind of soprano kind of guy in their especially in their elite units, like the paratroopers. They're gutsy, but not afraid to kill, and they're the ones that may be dominant at the top as well. So using a tac nuke from them, their moral point of view is not so bad, and that's scary. So as much as we would like a von Stauffenberg, don't forget he was a von. As much as you might detest the Germans, a von has a certain kind of, there's a little bit of chivalry in there, you might call it, I don't know. But even though von Stauffenberg didn't do it to stop the extermination of the Jews, he did it because it was doing something bad to Germany. And it was morally wrong, the whole thing about with Hitler. But so that's unfortunately my take on it, is that the wrong people have made it to the top, and therefore there's a predilection to use WMDs. That's unfortunate.
But the whole thing about the WMD is that, in other words, once they use that, they've broken through a precedent. And again, that would, in other words, just dealing with Ukraine itself. What if at that point, somebody smuggled, I mean, this is a little far-fetched, but somebody smuggled a tactical nuke to the Ukrainians and they decided to use it on Russian forces. Again, there's an escalation there, that breaks the rules. So far, Ukraine hasn't done anything through subversive means of attacking Russia, anything within Russia proper, or Belarus for that matter. The fighting has been maintained within Ukraine's borders. But once you start taking, letting these particular genies out of the bottle, okay, once you start taking the gloves off, what's to stop it? And again, there's one theory that says once somebody sees a mushroom cloud, they're not going to know, and they may not even care whether it's a tactical nuke or regular nuke. Tactical nukes, some tactical nukes can do more damage than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So the fact of the matter is, some people may not care. And I don't know, is anybody in the Kremlin sitting there and saying, do we want to go this extra step? you know, that's a big extra step. It's one thing to use hypersonics, but to go into the nuclear thing, they actually probably would be better off going into the chemical thing, because chemicals already chemical warfare has already been used, so they're not breaking any precedent there. But do you think that even in the minds of some Patton-esque nutcase, by Patton-esque I mean George Patton style nutcase, is something in the Russian forces who would say, or Douglas MacArthur, who wanted to drop the 50 nukes on China, somebody who doesn't understand what the capacity is, what the implications are, don't you think there might be something or somebody there stopping him and saying, wait a second, we're crossing a line there that could easily work against us?
Absolutely, there ought to be, but like I'm saying, there's a certain upward mobility, a fast track for the kind of guy.
You have been listening to and watching an episode of Going Viral, recorded on March 23rd, 2022. Panelists tonight were Ken Aaron from Los Angeles, Dennis Goldstein from New Jersey, Stephen Jonas from Long Island, Mike Jankowitz from Queens, and Frank Radford. The program was ended abruptly due to a loss of power in the studio. Thanks for watching, and we'll be here again next week, usually Tuesday and Wednesday night. Thanks again, and good night.